You mentioned that Aurelia puts a lot of emphasis on beauty in space. I want to take a digression here. What role does beauty play? What power does beauty have? Let's imagine there's a space cathedral, and the primary objective for it is aesthetics. Like it just has to look good. How would you justify investing all those resources and spending all that money to build a building that's main objective is just looking good? How do you quantify that impact of beauty?
I think that's an interesting question. I think, in the past, we still appreciate these buildings that have gone up, like the Hagia Sophia or the Notre Dame, or these buildings that existed and maybe were regarded as a colossal waste of church funds in some cases. But still, people are going and walk inside the Sagrada Familia Church, and you walk in there and you're like, oh wow, this is beautiful. And you can't really, I think, understate the permanence of that sort of thing. Even farther back, if you think about like the Great Wall or like Machu Picchu, these ruins that are still in existence. And you can see that someone wanted to create something. And additionally, they wanted to create something that wasn't just practical. They wanted to go farther. And I think humanity has always wanted to infuse beauty and art into the ways we build structures and the way we live in places. And I think that's just part of who we are, because it's kind of part of that human experience of living in a place, is like putting our fingerprint on it a little bit, cave painting handprint on it. Yeah. And so I think it's not necessarily a conversation about monetary value of like wasting money in decoration so much as how do we merge form and function in the way that we do things, in the way that we construct, our living spaces, our workspaces, even extending that to space,
Yeah, why bring the monetary values? Because it just costs so much more in space. Like payloads are measured by the gram. So this question of investing resources becomes, I guess, it gets amplified 10x more when you're building buildings just for beauty in space. And I'm sure that's going to come up at some point. But you feel like there is a case to be made about just building beautiful structures, no matter what the cost is, because the feeling it evokes is much more powerful.
Yeah, and I think there's stepping points on the way between like a colossal waste of space and resources and a purely functional thing. There's a gradient in there, right? And you can definitely find a sweet spot in the middle there. I did a lot of thinking about cost to orbit and cost benefit for my PhD work a while ago, and it was in the context of going to Mars. And there's a little bit of, well, like if you're going to go and you're going to do this mission, there's a minimum cost that you just have to accept, because you got to launch it. You got to launch something, and it's got to go to Mars. And so even though mass is still a huge influence on how we think about launching things to space, it's sort of like you're launching a lot already. And so it's not necessarily like a robotic exploration mission where you're minimizing, a ton or a few tons. It's like you just need multiple tens of tons of material. And at that point, it's like, not saying that we should make our landers on Mars look like really frilly and beautiful. I don't think we're at that stage yet. You need to have the infrastructure there. But there's definitely a sort of maybe sunk cost is the way you think about it. But that's the way I think about it a bit.
You mentioned the sweet spot. Do you think we have to reevaluate what that sweet spot might be? Because there's a generally accepted baseline for what's considered beautiful. You mentioned some great monuments, that are examples of beautiful monuments. But in space, it might be likely that we see buckyballs or plesiohedrons or the Nautilus shape. These are shapes that are not conventional in architectural structures on Earth. Do you think we'll have to there's a learning component involved where we have to open ourselves up to these newer structures to actually find them beautiful compared to the structures that we have on Earth?
I think so. I think there's going to be a bit of a learning curve of what is beautiful in space, because it's just going to be built differently in space. Something else that we think a lot about is materiality, and I think maybe like minimalism and kind of patina is like the word I would use. It's like when you have a leather jacket or like a stone that wears over time, or like a wood that wears over time. Yeah. And how do you, in on Earth, I feel like a lot of the late 20th century, 21st century has been like fighting against nature into like between brutalism and now kind of our modern minimalist aesthetic, where you see apartments that are like mostly steel and like painted over wood and white and clean and sparse. And some people really like that. And I do appreciate a nice minimalist space. Like this office is pretty minimal in a lot of ways. But I think the more we think about living in space, the more we're pushing against this sort of sterile lab environment. It's already like that. And we're trying to reinfuse natural elements, things like maybe not wood, because the Soviets tried to use wood in a space station and it like didn't work out too well. It messes with the humidity pretty aggressively. And so how do you add things that patina over time, things that are natural elements, biophilia, plants, even just things that are maybe people don't regard as squishy or as a beautiful, like squishy things or organic looking things, because, you know, if you don't like nature, you don't like algae and things like that, maybe you don't find that beautiful. Yeah. But if your whole environment is sterile and all you want to do is think about, you know, some undersea life or the way you engage with nature, I think infusing that back end is like taking that natural beauty and all of the roughness that comes with that and putting it in a space.